Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Auspicious Elections podcast. Today is Sunday, December 31st, 2017, starting at 3:46 p.m. We are trying to catch the very tail end of a Gemini rising election with 28 Gemini rising right now here in Denver. So joining me today, of course, for our 13th episode is Leisa Schaim. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Chris.
All right, and it is New Year's Eve, and we are scrambling to get our final electional episode out of the year. This is episode 13, and I think we're just going to be able to pull it off. So thanks for getting these elections together for us today.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll be celebrating tonight. We've got some kombucha and some chocolates, and it's going to be a pretty wild New Year's Eve, I think.
Yeah, wild night in, but still lots of chocolate.
Yeah, lots of packing posters, which people should definitely order a copy of. I wish I had a copy of the Planet Watcher poster, but we have Planet Watcher out this year, and it's actually really useful for electional purposes because then you can look up at the poster at a glance and see exactly when sign ingresses are taking place, when stations are happening, and when lunations and other things like that are taking place. And I know it's something that I actually use pretty frequently on a day-to-day basis, but especially within the context of elections for that purpose. And I know you've got one up on your wall as well, right?
Yeah, for a long time, every year I've had it right in front of my computer at my desk. It's really helpful.
Okay, so everybody can order a copy of the poster at theastrologypodcast.com/2018 posters, and it comes with a nice little 4-pack. So we're doing that right now. It's kind of exciting. So everyone should order a poster. Let's get into our elections this month. Let me pull up the chart for right now, first off, just to share the sort of astrology of the moment. So for those that are watching the video version of this, here is the chart for the very last few hours, basically, of 2017, where we have Gemini rising, Mercury's in Sagittarius, and these have actually been some really good. So to do, usually in the first part of these episodes, we reflect a little bit on the past month of elections and some of the things we've seen and some of the things that we learned and either confirmed from what we expected or were unexpected things that disconfirmed something. One of the things, when it actually comes, sometimes we've noticed a difference in doing this over the past several years where you can pick out elections ahead of time for like the next month, and you're usually trying to pick out the ideal ones. But usually when it comes time to, you're actually living in that month, you're getting up every day and you're seeing the different rising signs that are available and which ones when you just like have to do something and which ones you think are okay enough to use versus which ones are not okay or are so bad that you just avoid them completely. And sometimes you find that there's some rising signs that end up working better than you expected or that you're sort of forced to use for practical reasons that end up being okay. And I feel like the Gemini rising elections during basically the latter part or the second half of December, especially once Mercury stationed direct, have been really good charts for me, especially once Saturn left Sagittarius, because then all of a sudden we didn't have Saturn in the 7th and Gemini rising charts for the first time in 2 or 3 years. Mercury was just stationing direct in Sagittarius, and despite a somewhat loose square with Neptune lately, it was relatively unafflicted, and so far a lot of those charts have been working out relatively well for me. How about you?
Yeah, I would say the same. And something that was really standing out to me after Saturn left Sagittarius was that the Virgo rising charts were now usable, because formerly, for the last few years of his Virgo rising, you would get Saturn in a night chart and angular. And so I would just had gotten accustomed to a certain time of day. You just had to stop doing important things or, finalizing them or what have you. And so that's been a really nice change. I would agree that the Mercury, it hasn't been applying to something in particular, but it's just angular and it's out of the way of Saturn. And so has been kind of a nice neutral chart to use.
Right.
or
There's so
neutral
many other
aspects.
ones in here where it's mixed. Like if you try to use
Hmm.
Jupiter, you've got Mars and Jupiter together in the same sign, and so there's kind of a mixed bag there.
Right.
If you try to use like Venus or the Sun, you've got it now with Saturn and Capricorn. So Mercury is like the only planet where it's just like you're saying, it's not mixed. It's just kind of straightforward in that sign, and the
Hmm.
rest of the mutable signs are relatively clear, so that you're not like making anything else bad angular if
Right.
you pick, Gemini or Virgo rising.
Yeah. And I mean, if people are getting used to using elections, you'll notice that it's not like it's doing anything in the opposite direction. It's not like a particularly amazing chart, but it's just nice and neutral. You're not actually highlighting anything negative. The only negative thing was, when Mercury was retrograde and then stationed direct, it was fairly close to Neptune. It didn't go back to exact, but it was within like a couple degrees, I think, when it stationed direct. And so, that was a little bit I think there were some things that came out of that, some confusion and whatnot. But now it's getting far enough away that that's not really an issue.
Right. I actually had a lot of funny stuff with that whole 3 week retrograde in Sagittarius where I was trying to get the posters together, and I got serious about doing the posters at the very beginning of Mercury slowing down and stationing retrograde in like late November, early December. And at that time, I started learning that most of my assumptions about how I was going to be able to print and ship the posters were wrong. And I had to go through this whole series of like revising my plans and revisiting them and going back over things and finding things were mistaken and doing it again. And I thought I was finally going to be free. I ordered the posters, and I had them print up 1,000 posters. So I really committed to this project of the Planet Watcher and the other posters. And I was supposed to receive them towards the end of Mercury retrograde when it was getting ready to station direct. And there's the ascendant just switching over to Cancer right now. So, but then of course, Mercury was not fully direct by the time I did receive the posters. And they supposedly, I was looking at the tracking, and suddenly the tracking switched to saying that they were delivered already a day early. But I was here at home when that happened. And of course, the posters were not actually delivered. So the posters ended up not showing up for a week. I ended up fighting with like the printing company and with the shipping company, FedEx, who was claiming that that somebody had accepted the posters and it was a roommate of mine or something like that. And the delivery person was totally just lying or something about it, because they ended up delivering them, but not until a week later. And by then, the print company had sent a second order, so that virtually on the same day, around the time that Mercury stationed direct in Sagittarius, I ended up with 2,000 posters instead of 1,000. So now I have no idea what I'm going to do with 2,000 posters, but that was a nice little Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius story.
Hmm. Yeah, it definitely was just that whole time. And I don't know, I feel like you have a lot of those Mercury retrograde snafus that come up. But this was definitely an illustrative one.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit less willing, less what prudent, or there's some term.
You don't like to wait.
I don't like to wait. Like it comes up, and then I always feel, not always, but especially if Mercury's activated that year, or it's like one that's hitting something in my natal chart, I often don't follow my own advice and just putting things off or delaying until after the retrograde or later in the process. But oftentimes I just do it. And oftentimes then I go through a process where it's like difficult, or you have delays, or you have to revisit things and rethink your plan of action or stuff like that. And it ends up being much more of a hassle than it could have been. But sometimes that process can be useful and necessary. And so instead of avoiding it, sometimes I just feel like I have to do it, because sometimes you've got to do what you've got to do, and you can't put off your life indefinitely, just because Mercury is retrograde or something like that, because it happens so frequently.
Yeah, definitely. And, sometimes like this time, there are times when you can't wait. And so you have to do the thing no matter what.
Right. Because this
And
was like, it's the end of the year. If I'm going to do a poster, I need to get it printed now.
right.
Nobody's going to buy a poster in like February, so I can't put this off for another month. If I want to do it, I have to do it now. So I went ahead and did it, expecting some delays potentially, and I did actually get them. But everything worked out in the end so far.
Yeah. And it's a good illustration of what happens when you don't wait, and a Mercury retrograde is basically just inconveniences and so forth. But, it can still work out in the end. You just have to expect that there will be those snafus.
I also liked it because I think I used like Mercury elections for some of the final timing, even though it was retrograde, because everything else was afflicted. And one of the classical, interpretations of Sagittarius and what's problematic for Mercury is that Mercury in Jupiter ruled signs goes overboard. And that's why it's considered to be in detriment or in the sign of its adversity during those times, or the sign of its exile, or whatever you want to call it. There's many different names. And, people, for example, at natal charts that have Mercury in Sagittarius are known to sometimes go overboard in communication or being very verbose. Like Rob Hand is a famous Mercury in Sagittarius type guy. He has like a 3-planet or 4-planet stellium in Sagittarius, and he'll go on very long, like digressions during his lectures. And it's always very entertaining. But there's this like discursiveness about it. But then the other thing, of course, is that traditionally mutable signs were called double-bodied signs, and they were always supposed to give two of whatever they indicated.
Right. That's funny.
So it was actually kind of funny that I used some of these Gemini rising elections, and while I did end up with some, Mercury retrograde antics, in the end, once it hit station direct, I ended up with twice as many posters as I had intended to order. So
right.
2,000 instead of 1,000.
That's a really great example.
Yeah. So anyway, so that was my Mercury retrograde story, and that's one of my lessons for what I learned in December of 2017.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So how far into this are we? All right. We've been talking for 10 minutes. So why don't we get to the elections? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to close the animate wheel, and I'm going to pull up our first election, which is set for January 6th.
And do you want to first say any more preliminary things about this month coming up? Or do we want to discuss that for a minute?
I mean, it's up to you.
Okay. Yeah, just a couple more notes. So as of late December, Saturn's now in Capricorn. And so it's actually a planet in its own sign for the next 3 years. And so that's unique because we can now use some Capricorn rising elections, and you will see one in the charts that were picked out for this month. So that's unique because we couldn't use Capricorn rising before because it was Saturn in the 12th in Sagittarius for quite a while now. But now we have it in its own sign. This month in January, we do have a lot of night charts that have a lot of planets ruled by Saturn now, in terms of lots of planets in Capricorn and Aquarius, just the quicker moving transits going through those two signs. And so that's something to be aware of with night charts, because even though Saturn is in its own sign, which makes it more positive than it would be otherwise, it still doesn't negate that Saturn is in the night chart is kind of less good. And so that's just something to be aware of in terms of lots of planets being ruled by that night chart Saturn during January, if you do night charts. Conversely, that does kind of make me want to do more day charts so that all those planets are more constructive. But Mars is still with Jupiter presently. And so anytime you highlight one, you highlight the other. And so you can't get a pure Jupiter election right now. It's always going to be with Mars in a day chart. And then, of course, Mars is the more challenging planet in day charts. So it's a little bit of like a, one or the other kind of thing going on this month.
Yeah. And I've been using some of these lately over the past week or two, some Aries rising elections where you have Aries rising, like I have it here on the chart for the video right now. And Mars is in Scorpio in the 8th, but it's applying, so it's in its own sign, it's in its own domicile in Scorpio, and it's applying to a conjunction with Jupiter in a day chart. And as long as you mitigate it by having Mars, especially sextiling the MC or sextiling some planet in the 10th, I think you can actually get away with that election. So that's always the trick. If you have to put an important planet like the ruler of the ascendant in one of the bad houses, like the 6th or the 8th or the 12th, just make sure it's mitigated by a close aspect within 3 degrees to either the degree of the midheaven or to a planet in the 10th or 4th houses. So I've been using these for the past few days, and it's relatively good for some financial things, especially, it's in the eighth house, so it's automatically dealing with other people's money, but then it's applying to a benefic in the eighth house. And so there's the potential for like a fortunate or a positive financial outcome in the future for you, the one initiating the action, as the first house party.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be a little bit different if you were like on the receiving end and you were the seventh house party. But if you're the one initiating the action, which typically you are for most electional purposes, then it's not a bad chart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I haven't used those, but it is nice because of those things you mentioned. Rising sign wise, I think in January, some of the best ones are going to be either Scorpio rising still at night, because you've got Mars in a night chart in its own sign, and it's still with Jupiter. It is applying to Jupiter for a little bit longer. And then you can do some Cancer rising ones, depending on the moon placement, of course, as pretty much any month. You have to do a day chart with that one, though, because you do put Saturn in the seventh house.
Right. So you need to do it before sunset.
Yeah, before this. Yeah, while the sun is over the horizon, you need to do, if you're going to use a Cancer rising. Same with Capricorn rising. And then there are a couple other ones, but those are kind of some of the main ones that you can use more consistently, I think, this month. There's a couple other in the charts that we'll see.
Scorpio and Cancer.
Yeah, Scorpio, Cancer, possibly Capricorn.
Right. And I actually, to give an example of what I used the Aries rising one that I mentioned in order to purchase the rights to Planet Watcher from Kirk Kahn like a few days ago. And that was kind of my thinking there, is that you have like an exchange, like a first house, second house exchange, but making sure it goes smoothly and that it ends up being beneficial financially for the people involved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Should we jump into the first election?
Yeah, I think so. So let's go to that first one. It looks like that's going to be January 6th, around 2:44 a.m., which makes it 15 Scorpio rising.
There's the chart.
All right. So this one, it's one of the Scorpio rising ones that we can still use with the night chart. So as I mentioned earlier, that makes Mars in its own sign of Scorpio in the first house. At this time early in the month, it's still just applying to a conjunction with Jupiter. It hasn't started separating yet. And so that's really nice to be able to still get, especially when it's applying so close to exact. The moon is in Virgo in the 11th house. And the 11th house is one of the, quote, good houses. And it is applying to a trine, pretty close trine here in this time zone at least, although you could have done it earlier in that same rising sign. But the moon is applying to a trine with Venus in the third house, and Venus is the benefic of the sect at night, so that's really positive. So you've got kind of two really positive and close benefic applications in this one. The time I picked here in Denver, it does put the midheaven at about 24 Leo rising. And that was chosen because Mercury in Sagittarius is trine the midheaven at that point. And this is a little bit, you could use it for different things, of course, but since the moon is in the 11th house of friends and groups and associations, the ruler is Mercury, and that wasn't as prominent. And so especially if you were going to use it for 11th house matters, you might want to try to configure Mercury to the midheaven in order to strengthen the ruler of the 11th house a little bit.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And the ruler of the moon itself as well.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
I used one of these elections. So this was kind of similar to your best election from last month, which came at the very end, like the 28th and 29th of December. And I used an election basically just like this to launch the announcement of the posters and to launch the forecast episode, on Friday. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the things, was using the Scorpio rising chart with Mars ruling the ascendant, applying to conjunction with Jupiter, and then mitigating that second house Mercury placement by making it trine the degree of the midheaven.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So those were some of the main features of this chart. Something that is also nice but accidental is that Venus and the Sun are close in degree to that ascendant. And so Venus is also sextile the ascendant, which is kind of a nice bonus, even though that wasn't intentional.
Right. All right. That's a pretty nice chart. Both the ruler of the ascendant and the moon, which are the two most important planets in any chart, are both applying to very close aspects with benefics, which is kind of rare. It's what we always kind of shoot for ideally, but it's not that often that you can get them that close like they are in this chart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, and one other nice thing about this one is, I was talking earlier about the pileup of planets that will happen in Capricorn and Aquarius in night charts. This one, Mercury, is still in Sagittarius. So it is like one fewer planet that's ruled by Saturn in a night chart temporarily.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. All right. Well, that looks pretty good to me.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and financial, actually, it's the ascendant ruler is applying to the ruler of the second house. And then the ruler of the moon is also in the second house. So, I mean, that's kind of interesting, even though it's not a day chart. And so Jupiter isn't fully benefic, but you could potentially use this for financial matters as well.
Yeah. It's like if this is a horary chart and it was a question like, will I make money from this? Then you would look at it and you'd see the ruler of the ascendant closely applying to conjunction with the ruler of the second. And the answer would be yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's actually further confirmed by the moon as a secondary significator applying to sextile both of those planets after it completes the trine with Venus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the only cautionary note would just be, since the moon in this time zone is pretty closely applying to Venus, you just make sure and check your time zone and that it hasn't passed the exact trine. And if it has, you can certainly move the ascendant degree up some. It doesn't have to be 15 if it otherwise means you won't get the application.
Okay, right. Yeah, that's really important to note for people where that's sort of where it's on the line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the first chart of the month.
All right, awesome. And the next chart occurs pretty close after. It looks like there's a gap where we've got two auspicious charts in like the very first part of the month, and then the rest are much later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the next one's just a couple of days later. That's going to be January 8th, around 7:26 a.m., which does make it Capricorn rising. It's about 18 degrees Capricorn rising. So this is an interesting one. It's got the Sun and Venus cazimi in the first house. So cazimi is when a planet is so close to the Sun that it's kind of in, quote, in the heart of the Sun. And so instead of making it less positive, which would be the condition of under the beams, where a planet is getting too close to the Sun and it's kind of disappearing under the Sun's rays, and so it's considered less auspicious for that particular planet that's close to the Sun. When it gets almost exact, the idea is that it flips to the opposite and it makes it the most positive because they're almost completely conjoined together. So we've got a Sun-Venus cazimi in the first house, and it's right on the ascendant here. You do need to make this a day chart because it is Capricorn rising. And so I've made it just barely a day chart so that it's still a day chart, but the Sun-Venus is emphasized. Then the moon is in Libra in the 10th house. And the Libra is, of course, ruled by Venus. So the moon is applying by a few degrees, maybe about 4 degrees, square to Venus with reception because it's in the sign that the moon is in. And so that is all pretty positive. Mars and Jupiter up in the 11th house, unfortunately, they are separating now. So Mars isn't applying to Jupiter anymore. And let's see what else was going on in this chart. I think those were the main things. But cazimis are, a little bit uncommon. So it's nice to kind of feature that so prominently. And then
right. What was funny in the forecast episode is that Austin was really focused on and talking about that conjunction as being really important on this date and was emphasizing it. And then that of course, was a nice segue into the fact that this was our auspicious election that we wanted to highlight for the month for the forecast episode.
Right. That's nice. Yeah.
Because Venus is going to go retrograde this year. And this is like the beginning of that whole cycle, or at least in terms of its synodic cycle, because it's direct and it's conjoining the sun on this date and moving really fast. But that's in January, at the very beginning of January. But once you get to later this year, it's going to slow down and station retrograde. So it's like an interesting as a starting point, especially as an electional chart, that you would use it at a time when the sun is basically just beginning its cycle, or Venus is just beginning its cycle relative to the sun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would say the main downside is that Mercury is in the 12th house and then getting sort of close to conjoining Saturn, and that's not really a very great place for Mercury. So you should still think about what you want to use the election for, and if it's for mercurial matters, that might not be the best one to use. But otherwise, it's pretty strong. Some people will probably note that the Venus-Sun conjunction is also very closely applying to Pluto, which is close to the ascendant there as well. And that's definitely something that's there. And, you know, it's probably an illustration, a continuing illustration that we talk about from time to time about how, you know, elections are not about finding perfect charts. They're about finding the best of what's available. So there can be some, I mean, on the one hand, that could be sort of positive, really powerful, you know, things that you're going to use the election for. But, you know, there could be some downsides with Pluto in terms of any sort of power struggles or things like that.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And this is an example of, it's like with this, you had focused on the Scorpio rising elections, and I had asked you if there's other, can we get a Saturn election in there now that Saturn's in Capricorn and the sun is far enough into Capricorn that we could potentially get a day chart, and this is what you came up with, so that you can actually use that Saturn in Capricorn and place it in the first whole sign house, but just it being so crucial that you make it a day chart. And I want to make sure that nobody messes that up, because that could be problematic if you made it a night chart. It wouldn't be the end of the world, but it would definitely create more challenges and like obstacles than you would have otherwise if you made this a night chart.
Yeah, for sure. That's super important. If anyone wants to use this, just keep an eye on where the ascendant is and make sure the sun's above it.
Yeah, and this one's nice because all you have to do in order to figure out the timing for your location is just figure out when sunrise will take place that day, especially in terms of, you know, at the moment of or just after the sun has risen over the ascendant, but while it's still Capricorn rising, so don't let it move into Aquarius rising. But as long as it's still Capricorn rising and the sun has risen up over the horizon in your location, wherever you're living, you know, then you're in good shape and you can begin whatever your election is.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I guess that's it for chart number 2.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. One more note I just remembered. So that is it for chart number 2. My only other sort of addition was that some time zones can catch Cancer rising that night and still get the moon applying to Venus. We can't in our time zone, in Mountain Time Zone. But you might as well check if you're thinking about using an election that day and see if that's also an option for you.
Right. You'd have to make sure you did it before sunset, though, because if you make it a night chart and the sun sets, and you've got Saturn in the 7th in a night chart, which is no good.
Definitely. Yeah, all Cancer rising and Capricorn rising elections this month, you do need to make sure that it's a day chart the whole time.
Right. Okay. Sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
So after that, we've got a large gap between the 18th and the 20th, and then the next electional chart you found is on January 20th, right?
Mm-hmm. So it's going to be January 20th around 4:45 p.m. I put the ascendant at 27 Cancer rising here, and so with Cancer rising, the moon is ruling the ascendant, and it's placed in the ninth whole sign house in Pisces. And depending on your ascendant, you can place it late or early, and of course, it may vary a little bit with your time zone, but the moon was applying very closely to a sextile with Mercury. So if I had done an earlier rising sign, then the moon would still be applying to Mercury. Doing it later made the moon-Mercury sextile past, and now the moon is applying directly to a trine with Jupiter. And that has reception because Jupiter rules Pisces. And so that makes their connection even more positive. So that was actually the reason I did a late rising sign or a late rising degree in this particular election. But you could move it up, particularly if you wanted to focus it more on Mercury matters. You could do it where the moon was sextiling Mercury first. Either way, you've also got a nice Mercury-Jupiter sextile in this chart. So making the moon apply to Mercury first would just emphasize Mercury further, but you could kind of do that either way.
Yeah, I was wondering why you put it so late, but that kind of makes sense if you want more of the direct application to Jupiter, just making it just after Mercury, the moon has completed its sextile with Mercury, so that you have Jupiter applying, or the moon applying to Jupiter while the moon also being in Pisces, so that there's reception between the two.
Right.
So you almost couldn't get a more positive application of the moon to a benefic. It's like a trine to a benefic that's of the sextant favor. The benefic is superior, and it's a day chart.
Right. Yeah. All of those things make it really nice when the moon's directly applying to Jupiter. That was one reason why I moved the ascendant later. The other reason is that some people will probably notice the moon is still pretty close to Neptune, even though it's separating. And so I was also trying to get the moon a little bit further away from Neptune because, even though those other things that are positive would still apply, the ascendant ruler conjoined Neptune, or even if it's slightly separating but still very closely conjunct, is just, a recipe for a little bit more confusion to be added into the mix. And, usually you want to minimize that when you're trying to start something important.
Right. That makes sense. And this would be really good for ninth house matters, especially things like education or I'm trying to see travel would not be that bad either. Mm-hmm. Like a long distance trip or a journey or like a pilgrimage of some sort with the ruler of the ascendant in the ninth house and applying to a trine with the ruler of the ninth house at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
the ruler of the ninth itself is with Mars, but in a day chart, but at least they're separating and it's with reception. So it's not that problematic.
Mm-hmm. And travel-wise, the ruler of the third, which is Mercury, is also in this chart, at least closely square the midheaven. I was kind of trying to get the midheaven not squaring problematic things. If you configured it to the Sun Venus, if you put the midheaven, for instance, in early Aries and had that sextile the Venus Sun in Aquarius, which are in the 8th house, then you could mitigate the 8th house placement from those planets. The problem is that Saturn is also at 3 degrees, and so it would square the midheaven at the exact same time that the sextile would happen. So I didn't really want to emphasize Saturn squaring the midheaven. So that was one of the reasons I didn't do that.
Sure, that makes sense. All right. Any other points for this chart?
No, I think those were the main points.
Okay. So it looks like the next election actually takes place on the very next day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the next morning, even overnight, kind of January 21st around 2:03 a.m., which makes 19 Scorpio rising. And so this is another one where Mars is in a night chart and it's in the first house, ruling the ascendant. It's not applying to Jupiter anymore, so it makes it a little less auspicious, but it's still fine. At least it has rulership. The moon is a little bit later in Pisces now in the 5th house, and it's still doing that exact trine to Jupiter. It is in a night chart now, so Jupiter is a little less auspicious, but it's still got reception and it's still a close trine, so that's pretty nice. And this would emphasize more 5th house matters, like pleasure and things of that sort. Let me see if there was anything else I was thinking with this. Yeah, I think that was the main thing. It was kind of a straightforward election, this one.
Yeah, it's nice that it has Venus angular in a night chart in the 4th whole sign house, because Venus is finally out of Capricorn and at least free from a sign-based conjunction with Saturn for the first time in like a month or so.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it's a Scorpio rising election. Mars is separating from Jupiter, but at least you have an angular Venus now, and the moon is applying to that trine with Jupiter with reception still.
Mm-hmm. And another kind of unintentional thing, but at least in this location, this happened to put 29 Leo on the midheaven. And if you use the fixed stars, I don't always super focus on that, but I do pay attention when there is a notable one that appears, and Regulus is one of them at 29 Leo. So that happens to be on the midheaven in this one.
Okay. Yeah, and you can also back up the ascendant a few degrees in order to make it sextile Mercury if you wanted to, in order to help Mercury out from what is a positive house. It's the third, but it's still cadent. So it could give Mercury a little bit more of a boost, especially if that's necessary or useful in terms of whatever the election is that you're trying to start, and if Mercury could be helpful in terms of that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right. And then we've got one more core electional chart, and it occurs 10 days later at the very end of the month.
Yeah, and this is going to bring back, the sort of controversy around whether to use or not use eclipse charts, because this is near one of the eclipses. And so this is January 31st around 11:28 a.m., which makes 21 Taurus rising. And I really liked being able to use this chart at the end of the month because once Mars got out of Scorpio, you could actually use Taurus rising, and it's pretty positive because Taurus rising, Venus is ruling the ascendant, it's in the 10th house, so really prominent, and it's applying to Jupiter. And now Mars is out of the way. And so I was just like, I know it's an eclipse chart, but that's otherwise really positive. The moon is in mid-Leo in the 4th house in this chart, and it's applying first to an opposition with Venus and then square to Jupiter after that. So Mercury is also now in Aquarius, just ingressed into Aquarius. And so that's in the 10th house. So, it's a more prominent Mercury election if you want that. The sun, Mercury in this chart is actually right on the midheaven, but it would be in the 10th house either way. So yeah, this definitely brings back up that question of like, are eclipses enough to not use an otherwise positive chart? And in this case, I'm like, I think I would use it.
Yeah, I still don't have any problem with using eclipses, and I still think that's a dumb rule that some astrologers have in terms of elections. And this is actually the almost 1-year anniversary then of one of the last major eclipse elections that you recommended, which was for February 10th of 2017, and that's when I launched my book.
Right.
And despite some craziness, which actually Austin, I think, attributed to the eclipse in terms of the immediate launch, it still ended up being a really successful and major event, and lots of copies were sold, and I think it was a success. So I'm still on team use eclipse charts when necessary, or when you can find good ones if the chart itself is auspicious like this one is, as opposed to an eclipse chart that is also bad or has other classically bad electional placements. Then of course that's just going to amplify the bad stuff. But if it's otherwise a good electional chart, then sometimes I think it's just amplifying or emphasizing the good things and the important of the event that will be born at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so too. And, like you mentioned with your experience with the book, it might be that there are, and I think what Austin was mentioning at some point back then was that there could be unexpectedness arising because of the eclipse. But, otherwise, this is a really strong chart. I think, would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, the ruler of the ascendant is in the 10th. It's with the sun and Mercury, which are all largely unencumbered, and they're all being overcome by a superior sign-based square from Jupiter, which is upon the 10th, or otherwise known as dominating or decimating those planets in Aquarius, because Jupiter is in the 10th whole sign house relative to them. So it's exerting a very powerful but also very benefic influence in a day chart over all 3 of those planets. All 3 of them are ruled by Saturn, which is very well placed in a day chart in the 9th whole sign house in its own domicile. The moon is separating from that opposition with the sun, so it's waning, and it's applying to Venus and then next Jupiter.
Right.
So yeah, this is a pretty highly auspicious chart, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when I saw that, I was like, no, this is definitely a usable chart. It doesn't matter about the eclipse.
Right, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to find anything that it's not. So the problem area is Mars
Hmm.
in a date chart, which is now in Sagittarius in the eighth house. So the eighth house is a little problematic or a little troubled. And that could be problematic for some financial matters, although primarily for the other party. If this was like a business transaction or a partnership, that would be problematic for the potential for like strife or difficulties in the area of the partner's finances.
Hmm.
And it's possible that some of that could leak over to the person who's initiating the action in their finances, since Mars is opposing the second, but the ruler of the second is otherwise relatively well placed. So I wouldn't necessarily consider that to be a deal breaker, and even in terms of personal financial matters on the part of the one initiating the action.
Yeah, I mean, and the ruler of the second is up in Aquarius, with that Jupiter overcoming it. So, I mean, it's actually, and it's in the same sign as Venus. So, I mean, it's got really positive things too.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah,
Yeah.
this is almost we could have picked this as the best election for the month. So that was a bit of a toss up, and it's surprising that we've got multiple really good elections for once in a single month compared to some of the past 2 months where we've really struggled to find anything.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And that was, I was looking forward to that when I was looking through the rising signs beforehand. So I was like, well, near the very end of the month, once Mars leaves Scorpio, then you can use Taurus rising.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty nice. Okay. And that's a good example then of why it's always good to know your ingresses.
Hmm.
And therefore, if you had a handy chart or calendar of some sort on the wall which listed ingresses, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So we have one more chart. You have an alternative time chart for the same date, right?
Yeah, there's one later. And let's see, that's an evening chart. Some time zones may be able to use this and some may not, but I listed it in case you can. This one's set for the East Coast in New York. So January 31st, around 10:43 p.m. in New York City, which makes it a 18 Libra rising. Because this is later on in the day, once the moon passes Venus in its opposition to Venus, it will still be applying to that square with Jupiter. And so I wanted to see if anything else was usable the rest of the day. And if you use Libra rising, Venus is ruling the ascendant placed in the fifth house. It's the benefic of the sect at night. And then it is still applying to a square with Jupiter itself. And then the moon is in the 11th house in Leo, and it's applying to a square with Jupiter still very closely now compared to earlier in the day. So this is an alternate time to potentially use depending on your time zone. I did not think it was usable here because when I set it for mountain time,
Here in Denver, you mean?
yes, in Denver in the mountain time zone, it unavoidably placed the IC really close to Saturn. And you don't, even though Saturn's going to be in the fourth house in general, which is not the best place for Saturn in a night chart. It makes it angular, but at least it's in Capricorn in its own sign. It makes it a little bit better. You don't really want to extra emphasize it by putting it right on an angular, placement like the ascendant or the IC or MC. So that is why I wouldn't recommend doing that if that's what happens in a chart set for your location. But if it doesn't, like in this chart, where you've got instead like the Jupiter sextile the IC.
Sextile the IC and trine the MC. Okay.
Then that makes it much better, and that makes it more of a potential chart to use.
Okay. Yeah, and that's it's problematic, or it's typically something we avoid putting a planet like Saturn in a night chart in the fourth house, since sometimes the fourth is associated with the final outcome of the matter or where things end up. And sometimes putting a prominent malefic in the fourth can be challenging in terms of the outcome for that reason.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that this is the best chart, but I was just looking to see if there are any other charts that day, if you still needed to do something where the moon Jupiter was still applying.
Yeah, and there's definitely some mitigations here since Saturn's in its own sign. Jupiter has a superior sign-based sextile over Saturn, and the moon and the ruler of the ascendant are relatively well placed.
Mm-hmm.
All right, very good. So that's a good sort of alternative chart if you really need to do something else and you can't use the one from earlier in the day.
Mm-hmm. Or if anyone feels strongly about the moon not being right on the node because it was earlier in the day.
And it also only really works basically east of our time zone in like New York and other East Coast type places, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, got it. All right. Well, that brings us then. So this is set for January 31st at 10:43 p.m. So that very closely brings us to the very end of the month then in terms of the elections that we can recommend.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any last things that we meant to touch on before we wrap up for the day?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of the main features earlier about the month in general and what's usable and what's not great. And of course, we'll always have the notes that are typed up with the elections as well. If you want to look at rising sign by rising sign, what looks good and not so good.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. And I will, as always, release this as both an audio and a video version. Starting to get better at like, animating the chart and using the video version. So I'm almost going to start recommending that people watch these with the video version if they can, so they can follow along visually what they're doing. But of course, we'll keep trying to gear it towards and keep it okay for the audio version as well by including the charts as handouts and including all those additional notes.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I guess that's it then. Our 45 minutes are up for this episode of the Auspicious Elections podcast. This was episode 13, and this brings us to the end of the year. So we've been doing this for a year now. We recorded our first one, was it in December of 2016?
Was it December?
I'm actually not sure because
I'm not sure if it was December or January.
I know this is episode 13, and we had done our 12th one in the last episode.
Okay.
So we're somewhere around there. Either way, we've been doing it. We've been doing it for a year now, which seems like a long time to me. And that's actually kind of exciting. It's a nice milestone. We've done 1 year of the Auspicious Elections podcast. It's really grown over the course of the past year. We've got more and more used to doing it. Mm-hmm. And we're starting to get a workflow down. We just got you a new laptop to use. So there's no like loud fan in the background. And we're working on improving audio quality. And thanks everyone who's been listening over the past year. Thanks for supporting our work because once I stopped doing the TMA column, I wasn't sure if we would keep doing this at all. But thanks to you guys for, signing up to support it on the through Patreon. You've basically made this happen and you've allowed us to be able to keep doing this work and to both provide you with useful charts and elections, but also to keep sort of expanding our research and being able to share it with you as a group in terms of our research into electional astrology and what we're learning from trial and error and experiment as we go. So thanks for making that happen.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. It's really exciting to know that people are using these elections and appreciate hearing about how you can proactively use astrology in your life like this.
Definitely. And so we're already starting to look into elections for next year. If anybody sees any really interesting or big ones coming up over the next 12 months, definitely let us know, since we're starting to keep our eye out for ones that are really far out in the future at this point. And together we will continue finding the best elections, the most auspicious elections that we can find over the next 12 months. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I think we have some celebrating to do. And by celebrating, I mean packing posters into tubes. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Happy New Year, everyone.
All right. Bye.